But far from vanishing, the Indians did something completely unexpected. It was the resilience of their culture, the resilience of the people that saw their populations rebound in the 1920s to the level they are today. So instead of vanishing the Indians, new policies, now policies of accommodations, had to be developed. Also, scientifically aware non-Indians, such as Peter Farr, acknowledged that early scientific disciplines, anthropology, ethnology, ethnomusicology, ethnobotany, archaeology, owes much to the study in a largely unrestricted manner in the storehouse of indigenous knowledge. Today, we live in a different era. An era of self-determination which promises much, but sometimes delivers less. So let's see what's been delivered legally, and what's the opportunity for taking some of these laws, some of these new policies that I say are the afterglow of virtue and ethics, and import them and export them across the world in the form of TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property agreements that are sponsored primarily by the large industrial nations such as the US. So let's take a look. My task focuses on how a new understanding of ethics, a new vision of science, a new appreciation of indigenous knowledge can contribute to a more respectful relationship and hopefully a deeper and richer America. Ethics. Until the last decade of the 20th century, the 90s of our past century, neither the Congress nor the US Supreme Court took much interest in the Indian people, certainly not in their rights of self-determination, nor did it take any affirmative role in protecting the cultural indigenous freedoms of those same people. If you look at those infamous decisions by the US Supreme Court, known as the Ling-Smith decision in 1988 and 1990, those decisions collectively closed the judicial doors to Indian free exercise of religion. So in frustration, the Indian people seeking to exercise justice outside the courts turned to Congress. Congress, as befits a Congress that's a trustee of the Indian people, responded somewhat. In 1990, Congress enacted what's called NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, provides some relief, some respect for Indian people. But what the law giveth, the law can taketh away. Witness the infamous decision in 2004 called Kenwood Man, substantially restricting NAGPRA's reach, turning over the body of this 9,500-year-old BCE individual to scientific study. Congress also wanted to change from hard law to soft law, historic preservation law. And in 1992, with the Indian amendments to the NHPA, our cornerstone historic and cultural preservation law, the National Historic Preservation Act, new types of cultural properties were created called TCPs. Traditional cultural properties were added to a long list of battlefields, presidents' houses, significant architectural accomplishments. And what TCPs mean? That for the first time, Congress, the non-Indian people began to respect the fact that Indian culture was not dead, that it had some continuing relational validity and vitality between contemporary Indian people and their own histories. Many of the TCPs you may know by other names. The First National Monument, Devil's Tower, Bears Lodge is now a TCP. Medicine Wheel, perhaps a product, if you're an archaeologist in the megalith culture, in the Bighorn National Forest, is a TCP. Cave Rock, sacred to the Washoe tribe at the boundary between California and Nevada, now a TCP. Yet, that amendment requires the Indians to negotiate, not as sovereigns, but as interested or consulting parties, insofar as they gain access to those sacred sites. They're merely one of many. The climbers, the picnickers, the bird watchers, and they have to argue over what amount of time and what seasons they may get to use those sites to preserve their continuing cultural relationships. So as I mentioned, if you come to law for salvation, it's like going to birds after you get hurt in a bad car accident. You have to take it on faith. Before I discuss the issues, let me take a look at the prior cultural resources law that predated NAGPRA and NHPA. There's only 2 or 3 major cultural resources statutes in America, and much of the global intellectual property statutes, insofar as it relates to indigenous resources, is patterned after those American laws. The first is the Antiquities Act, 1906. The Antiquities Act was designed by and designed for the emergent social scientists, the archaeologists, the anthropologists, the ethnographers, the ethnohistorian, the ethnomusicologist. And the reason they designed it was because their irreplaceable source of data was being destroyed by who? By grave robbers, pot hunters, on-train, grubby, mercenary money seekers who wanted to satisfy the new leisure class who have an aesthetic interest in those kinds of items of antiquity. 1906, first law on cultural resources. The problem is Congress didn't really care that much either about Indians at that time or about cultural resources at that time, because the only offense, Illinian, was a felony, was a misdemeanor for up to 6 months in jail or a fine of $500, and you could make that more than 1 day's cost of business with a good hit on a gravesite. It wasn't until about 73 years later, that Congress enacted the follow-up law called ARPA, Archaeological Resource Protection Act of 1979. Once again, law designed for, not Indian people, for scientists. Let me read you the definition of what an archaeological resource is. This is the regulation implementing ARPA out of the Interior. A statutorily covered archaeological resource must be capable of providing scientific or humanistic understanding of past human, notice not American Indian, behavior, cultural adaptation, and related topics through the application of scholarly techniques such as controlled observation, contextual management, measurement, control, collection, analysis, interpretation, and explanation. According to the leading cultural resource scholar of today, Dr. Patty Gerstenluth, she suggests that ARPA exhibits this odd dichotomy in the American consciousness about cultural resources. She argues that the majority culture seeks to preserve European-based elements of our cultural heritage out of respect for the past, but seeks to preserve our American Indian cultural resources out of scientific or economic interest. And ARPA, if the truth be known, remains our major, perhaps exclusive, archaeological cultural resource protection statute, despite the enactment of NAGPRA in 1990. What's the reason for that? If you look at the argument between the scientists, the Smithsonian scientists among others, and the affiliated tribes over the body or remains of Kennewick Man, the scientists argue that ARPA, the scientific interest, dominated over what they saw as mere folklore and superstition on part of the Indian people. Why sacrifice this revering of this irreplaceable data source to satisfy these 4 tribes' point beliefs? And who won? You already know this answer. The scientists, because the judge, the 3-judge panel, 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, didn't fully expect to enforce what they saw as an overreaching intent.